Mr. President, since President Biden took office just a little over 2 years ago, more than 348,000 unaccompanied children have crossed our southern border. To be clear, these 348,000 children did not arrive in the United States by themselves. Children often make this dangerous journey with friends, neighbors, or other relatives, and of course, in the custody of transnational criminal organizations, or what are otherwise known as coyotes, who get paid to smuggle people into our country. The sad reality is that many of these children come to the country in the care of these cartels, human smugglers, coyotes. Parents pay smugglers thousands of dollars to bring their child to the U.S., but the truth is the money doesn't guarantee their safety. The journey to the southern border is not easy or safe. Children are subjected to violence, exploitation, and sexual abuse on the way to the United States. And why in the world would anybody think if I turn my child over to a criminal organization that will smuggle them into the United States, how in the world would they ever have confidence that they would be safely transported here? So it sadly is not surprising. But as folks along the southern border and our border communities in Texas will tell you, trying to help these migrant children when they get here is no small task. There are laws that spell out how long a child can remain in custody, as well as the resources that they must receive, things like, of course, food, water, medical care, and adequate supervision. And I believe we do have a responsibility once those children get to our border and in our custody to make sure they are safe and well cared for. Given the huge number of children crossing the border every week due to the administration's open border policies, that job, caring for these unaccompanied children, has gotten nothing but more difficult. And we've seen the harrowing consequences. At the start of the Biden administration, holding cells in detention facilities were lined with children and other teens sleeping on gym mats with only a thin aluminum blanket to keep them warm. Thousands of children were stuck in Border Patrol facilities, which were never designed to hold children in the first place, but many of them were detained of necessity beyond the 72-hour limit contained in the law. And massive public facilities like the Joe Freeman Coliseum in San Antonio, these were used as emergency shelters because there was nowhere else to put them. But unfortunately, most of the public lost interest in these children after that point. Certainly, the Biden administration appears to have lost interest in these children once they made it past the border and were released from these various detention facilities. Because once children were placed with sponsors in the United States, save for a couple of isolated reports that should serve as warning beacons, Congress and the public didn't have any information about how they were doing, whether they were healthy, whether they were being treated appropriately, anything about their well-being. Well, that information deficit was recently filled by an investigative story by the New York Times. In February, the Times published its first story detailing the widespread child exploitation of migrant children. It includes stories of unaccompanied migrants who are working in dangerous jobs that violate child labor laws. For example, a 15-year-old girl who packages cereal at night in a factory, a 14-year-old boy who works on a construction job instead of going to school, a 13-year-old child day laborer, children working in meat processing plants, commercial bakeries, and for suppliers for automakers. This was all documented by the investigative report by the New York Times. We aren't talking about part-time gigs after going to school. These are grueling and dangerous full-time jobs that are meant for adults, not children. So the big question is how they got there. How on earth did the Biden administration allow so many vulnerable children to be exploited? After all, the administration should have been aware of the history of migrant children being exploited by their sponsors. In 2014, the Office of Refugee Resettlement placed 8 children with members of a human trafficking ring who posed as family or friends. These children were forced to work on an egg farm in Ohio with no pay for 12 hours a day, 6 or 7 days a week. They lived in deplorable conditions and were threatened with violence unless they complied. It was a disgusting and heartbreaking case of abuse that rightfully garnered a lot of attention. Given the sheer volume of cases the Biden administration has managed over the last 2 years, it should have been on alert for similar stories and similar cases. A high percentage of sponsored children could not be reached a month after their release, increased from 20% in 2020 to 34% in 2021. Let me say that again. These children are supposed to be placed with sponsors checked out by the administration, by Health and Human Services. But in 2020, 20% of those children were unaccounted for 1 month later. In 2021, it was 34%. Unfortunately, these warning signs went ignored, and the Biden administration did nothing to try to correct the problem. As the Biden border emergency crisis ramped up, emergency shelters were filling up, and the administration had a major public relations problem on its hand. Its top priority wasn't apparently the safety of these children, but the speed at which they could be moved from the border to sponsors with no follow-up. The Biden administration wanted to get these children out of the shelters and into the care of these sponsors as quickly as possible. To make that possible, Health and Human Services loosened vetting requirements and urged case managers to move faster with little regard for the danger that was created for these migrant children. In a staff meeting last September, Secretary Becerra reportedly told employees, he said, if Henry Ford had seen this in his plants, he would have never become famous and rich. That's not the way you do an assembly line. So this is the Secretary of Health and Human Services, the person leading the agency that's meant to care for these children, and he's telling his employees to create a manufacturing assembly line. He deliberately pushed for speed, and more speed because of the public relations problems that the administration was experiencing. Just 1 year earlier, during Secretary Becerra's tenure, nearly a dozen managers from the Office of Refugee Resettlement sent a memo expressing their concerns about labor trafficking, exactly the problem that the New York Times investigation exposed. They said they feared that the office had come to reward speed over safety, but apparently nothing changed. Earlier this week, the New York Times published yet another story with even more details on the administration's failure to protect migrant children. One of the most startling revelations was the sheer scale of the crisis. This chart shows the number of calls to Health and Human Services each month reporting trafficking, neglect, or abuse of migrant children who've been placed with sponsors by the U.S. government, specifically by the Biden administration's Health and Human Services Department. As you can see, the department was receiving fewer than 50 calls a month back in 2018, climbed in 2019 and 2020, and starting in 2021, the number of calls skyrocketed. And of course, these weren't just cases in which somebody spotted abuse and spoke up. We have no idea how many cases went unreported. But it's become breathtakingly clear that this widespread abuse wasn't caused by missteps. Of intentional policy decisions from top administration officials. As it turns out, the White House and federal agencies were alerted again and again that these children were at risk and did nothing. In 2021, the most senior career member of the Office of Refugee Resettlement sent an email to her bosses warning them that children were likely to be placed in dangerous situations. When her warning was ignored, she filed a complaint and requested whistleblower protection. Not long after she was moved out of her position, she then filed another complaint arguing that she was retaliated against, a move that is against the law. But sadly, this is not an isolated event. Within Health and Human Services, at least 5 staffers have filed complaints and said they were pushed out of their jobs for sharing concerns with their leadership about this extraordinary crisis of abuse or neglect. Well, the Labor Department was aware of child labor violations too. Last year, investigators identified major instances of child labor violations that took place in auto part factories and meatpacking plants. As they continued to uncover more and more cases of migrant children being exploited, the department shared its concerns with the White House. Former Labor Secretary Marty Walsh confirmed that the department included details about these situations in its weekly reports to the White House. So the White House was clearly informed about these issues. In December, the Labor Department even released a public report showing a 69% increase in child labor violations since 2018. Well, miraculously, the White House now claims to have no knowledge of this disturbing trend. Susan Rice, who serves as director of the White House Domestic Policy Council, which oversees virtually every aspect of domestic policy affairs, claims no knowledge of this problem. Even though we know that when the border crisis reached its fever pitch during the summer of 2021, Ms. Rice's team received a memo from Health and Human Service managers about labor trafficking. 2 people confirmed that Ms. Rice was told about the contents of the memo, but the White House now disputes that claim. Health and Human Services also provided the White House with frequent updates on a group of children being exploited in Alabama. But the White House now says senior officials were never made aware of this situation. Again and again, the Biden administration was told but failed to heed the warnings about these migrant children being exploited. And now, after major investigative reporting has been done by the New York Times, they refuse to accept responsibility and apologize. Instead, they decided the blame game is what they need to do. So HHS blames the Labor Department for failing to enforce child labor laws. The Labor Department says it shared information with HHS and the White House, but they failed to respond. And the White House blames both departments because even though they passed along information about potential abuse, they somehow didn't mark it as urgent. Well, to state the obvious, the Biden administration shouldn't need to be told that potential child exploitation is an urgent matter and deserves attention. It's self-evident. Given the history of migrant children being exploited and the massive scale of President Biden's border crisis, the administration should have been on top of this from the beginning. Clearly, they weren't, and they still aren't. And ultimately, the children they claim to be helping are the ones paying a terrible price. As the New York Times makes clear, the Biden administration knew that children were being exploited and willingly failed to act. It repeatedly brushed aside warnings and continued to prioritize speed over safety. So the American people need to know, is this an example of gross negligence, of whistleblower chilling, or just simply willful violation of the law by the Biden administration? Right now, the answer to all those questions appears to be a big and resounding yes. We need answers from Secretary Becerra, the Department of Labor, and Susan Rice on how this could possibly be allowed to happen and how it can continue to happen as I speak. We need accountability, and we need to see proof that there are being changes implemented to prevent this from happening in the future. But time and time again, the Biden administration have claimed that their approach to the border and immigration is fair, orderly, and humane. But there's nothing fair about putting children in the care of people who will exploit them. There's nothing orderly about ignoring warnings of child labor violations. And there's nothing humane about the way migrant children are suffering in silence across America. Mr. President, every member of this chamber, Republicans and Democrats alike, should be absolutely outraged by the Biden administration's abdication of responsibility, their obligation, our obligation, to protect these migrant children. I hope now that the New York Times has detailed the abuses that are occurring, it will somehow finally get the attention of the Biden White House, and they will finally take appropriate action to protect these children they claim to be helping, but in fact are being sacrificed to those who would exploit them and take advantage of them. President, I yield the floor.